The history of recording technology roughly parallels that of jazz history. The good thing about that is that most of jazz history was recorded. In any case, it's kind of fun to take a look at where we've come from in terms of recorded music. First up is the phonograph, the very first sound recording device, although that's a bit of a misnomer. The phonograph was invented in the mid-1800s by a French inventor named Leon Scott. His actual name is longer than that, but we'll keep it simple for now. The phonograph was intended as a way to create a visual image of sound by transferring sound waves to sheets of paper that were covered with soot. The images were called phonograms. Here's Mr. Audio to tell you more.
Does anyone know what a phonograph is?
You know, who'll know?
Tell us, Mr. Audio.
Back in 1859, almost 20 years before the Edison cylinder, French inventor Edouard Léon Scott de Martinville invented a device that could actually record sound. His invention was called the phonograph, and it traced a line that represented a sound wave onto glass or paper blackened by smoke. His intent was to be able to see on paper what speech or music actually looked like. Scott never considered that his recordings, called both phonautograms and phonoautograms, could ever be played back, since the waveform was only a flat image as opposed to a three-dimensional groove like those later created on the Edison cylinder. The technology didn't exist at that time to be able to hear what had been recorded. However, in 2008, using an optical scanner and a computer, many of the phonautograph recordings could finally be played back, making these the earliest recorded sound.
Thanks, Mr. Audio.
The first machine that could actually record and play back sound was the phonograph, which was invented in 1877. The phonograph was invented by the famous American inventor Thomas Edison. Edison's phonograph created three-dimensional engravings of the sound waves on cylinders covered with tinfoil. The operator would speak into a horn while hand cranking the machine to record the sound, and then he would switch the horn to act as a speaker. This demonstration is a recreation of the first words ever recorded as spoken by Edison.
Hello, hello, hello. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. Ha, ha, ha!
The phrase canned music was coined by the famed composer and bandleader John Philip Sousa to describe the tinny sound that came out of Edison's machine. This is an early example of a musician fearing loss of livelihood from technology. In addition to poor fidelity, Edison's cylinders had limited capacity and a short lifespan, and his invention was basically just seen as a novelty. He moved on to work inventing the incandescent light bulb. Edison's work on the phonograph was picked up in the 1880s by another inventor named Alexander Graham Bell, who's best known as the inventor of the telephone. Bell's invention was called the gramophone. The tinfoil on the cylinders was replaced by wax, which provided a higher level of fidelity and a longer recording time. In 1887, the German-American inventor Emil Berliner created the gramophone. The gramophone utilized a different recording medium that would dominate for nearly a century: flat discs instead of cylinders that were made from shellac and called records.
Years or maybe more, out on an island on a lonely shore, Robinson Crusoe landed one fine day. No rent to pay, no wife to obey. His good man Friday was his only friend. He didn't borrow or lend. They built a little hut, lived there till Friday, but Saturday night it was shut.
Although the flat discs initially offered lower fidelity than the wax cylinders, they were more portable and they offered the major commercial advantage of mass reproduction. 10-inch records spinning at 78 revolutions per minute produced about 3 minutes of recording time. So this became the standard length for a popular tune, and it's still true today. The cylinders and the records coexisted as competing technologies for a number of years, but ultimately the record won out and it remained the dominant reproduction technology for decades. Berliner's gramophone company became the Victor Talking Machine Company, which released the very first jazz record in 1917, featuring the original Dixieland Jazz Band. We're going to get to that coming up. Refinements to the record player included the folding horn, which replaced the large and visually intrusive horn by a series of hidden baffles. The volume could be moderated to a certain extent by opening and closing doors in front of the baffles. The folded horn could be considered an early example of what is referred to in audiophile circles as WAF, or wife acceptance factor. This is an example of good WAF, and this is an example of bad WAF. This is a photograph of a small orchestra recording into a large horn. Balance had to be regulated by the placement of musicians relative to the horn. This is a very famous photo of ethnomusicologist Frances Densmore recording a Blackfoot Indian chief. Densmore was famous for her study of Native American music and culture. One of the biggest advances in audio technology was with the use of electricity, which became widespread in the 1920s. The first electrical recordings were made in 1925, and you can hear the difference in fidelity when you listen to recordings from the era. In electrical recording, microphones and speakers replaced the dual function of the horn. The microphones converted sound waves into electrical signals. Speakers used an electromagnet to convert the electric signals from the microphone into sound by moving a paper cone back and forth. They still work pretty much the same way today. Vacuum tubes controlled the flow of electrons, and they were used for switches and volume controls. Record players, which were originally hand-driven and then run by a spring, could now be powered by electric motors. The brand name Victrola became the Electrola. Magnetic wires could contain and reproduce the sound waves as well. Fidelity of most wire recorders was low and was more suitable for speech than music. To improve fidelity, this BBC wire recorder moved the wire at a rate of 300 feet per minute. The wire was sharp, and if it broke and spun free, it could be lethal, so the operator stayed in another room. A major breakthrough came in 1928 when the German-Austrian Fritz Flumer invented the magnetic tape recorder. He replaced the wire with a tape coated with a chemical compound called oxide. Aside from representing less of a lethal threat, the magnetic tape could be erased and reused. Audio editors perfected the concept of precision cutting and splicing tape, which is where we get the term cut and paste. This is how audio recordings were edited until the advent of digital many decades later. 20 years later, in 1948, Columbia Records brought out the 12-inch, 33 1/3 long-playing microgroove record, which was wisely shortened to LP. Prior to the LP, most records were 10 inches in diameter, they turned at 78 RPM, thus the term 78s, and they were made from a very fragile shellac that would break if it was dropped. They were limited to 3 minutes of music per side, so longer pieces of music were recorded on multiple disc sets of 78s. Those sets were called albums, just like photo albums. The LP, which was larger in diameter, slower in rotation, and with smaller grooves, could hold 20 minutes of music on a side, so a single LP could contain as much music as a multi-disc set of 78s. The term album stuck, though, as it still does today. In 1949, RCA brought out the competing 7-inch 45 RPM record, known as 45s, designed to release singles especially for use in jukeboxes. The 45 held the same amount of music as a 78, but in a more compact size and with better fidelity. The hole in the center was bigger than on an LP, and we were forever searching for the little plastic adapters so we could play them on our record players. The Ampex Corporation invented stereo recording technology in the 1940s, and home stereo tape recorders became available in the 1950s. As a kid, I grew up with a record player radio combo like this one in the living room. Not everyone had stereo record players, so for a number of years records were released in both stereo and mono. Recordings that had been made in mono were synthesized to simulate stereo, and some people preferred the original sound. Large reel-to-reel recorders like this Revox offered the ultimate in high-fidelity sound for the home. Small reel-to-reel recorders offered convenience and portability. I'm convinced that I owned this very tape recorder, or one very much like it. Here's a selection of portable record players and tape recorders in the Sears catalog, which was the size of a city phone book. In the 1960s, the tiny transistor made possible things like pocket-sized radios and eventually computers. I had a radio like this one, too. Bill Lear, who founded Lear Jets, invented the 8-track tape as a way to play music in the car. 8-tracks were one of those things that we love to hate. It was playback-only continuous loop design with a complex mechanism of 4 pairs of moving heads that were prone to misalignment. You couldn't rewind them, only fast forward. The tapes themselves often jammed, and they wound up tossed on the floor of the car in disgust. The compact cassette from Philips, on the other hand, was a real winning design. They were small, less prone to jamming, and you could rewind and fast forward. The fidelity wasn't great at first, but that got better and better over time, to the point that they came close to the sound of the LP. The Sony Walkman cassette player was originally a one-off design for the president of the company. It was revolutionary, and I can still remember the first time I heard one. It provided high-fidelity sound from a tiny source, and it was the predecessor of the personal audio devices that we all have in our pockets now. Most Walkmans were playback only, but higher-end units like the Walkman Pro provided a high-quality portable recording solution. The modern era of digital audio began in 1981, with the release of the very first commercial compact disc featuring ABBA. Compact discs, or CDs, were more compact than records or cassettes. They offered instant track access, and they were free from record surface noise or tape hiss. Although the sound from CDs was billed as perfect, digital could sound harsh, and analog purists stood by the LP with wallets at the ready. In terms of audio editing, digital was a whole new world. Those of us who were studio musicians during that era witnessed the revolution firsthand. We take it for granted now, as we do all technological innovations. CDs were originally playback only. The introduction of the recordable CDR changed the game forever. It gave consumers the ability to make an identical copy of a recording without the loss of fidelity that came with making a tape recording. This set off a battle over copyright infringement and launched a change in the recording industry that is still ongoing. MP3s, which came along in the mid-1990s, were compressed digital files that allowed many more songs to be stored on a given hard drive size. It was mind-blowing how many songs could be stored on a tiny device, even though the first portable MP3 player had only a 32 megabyte capacity, which is less than 4% of a gigabyte. Now, even that capacity seems massive compared to this monstrosity from IBM with a memory storage capacity of about 1 MP3. This picture came from my son Cooper, who works for IBM. He photoshopped himself into the shot in a Mad Men-style pose. In 1998, the Recording Industry Association of America launched a lawsuit to prohibit the sale of portable MP3 players on the basis of copyright infringement. Consumers rebelled, as they always will when you try to take away something that they already have. The next year, Napster launched peer-to-peer file sharing, which skirted copyright laws, and it allowed for massive free downloading of recorded music. Apple's iPod launched in 2001 with either 5 or 10 gigabytes of memory. 20 years later, our phones have a much greater capacity than that, and yet the music files have remained the same, typically either MP3 or WAV. Today, consumer music is most likely to be streamed, eliminating the storage medium entirely. Now that's fantastic for music consumers, which includes musicians, but it pretty much shuts creators out of any profit for their recorded work, except for those at the very top echelon. And finally, taking us full circle, the iPhone gramophone, and I want one. Hey, thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, I'd love it if you would take a half a second to click the like button. There's lots more where this came from and lots more to come. Here's a couple of suggestions for where to go next.